Have you ever felt like you're walking through life with a heavy backpack strapped to your shoulders, when you never take off, no matter where you go? Inside that backpack are not just memories but regrets, not just moments but mistakes, and whether we like it or not, we carry them. Some of us try to ignore the weight, pretending it's not there. Others cling to it as if suffering somehow keeps us safe. But the truth is this: as long as we hold on to the shadows of yesterday, we will never step fully into the light of today. Think about it. Every choice, every action, every wrong turn you've taken has left a trace. Sometimes it feels like these traces are carved into stone, impossible to erase. Maybe you replay an old argument in your mind over and over again. Maybe you regret the opportunities you missed, or the words you wish you had spoken but didn't. And maybe, in the quiet of the night, those echoes come back, whispering to you that you're not enough, that you failed, that you'll never be free. But here's the paradox. Those whispers don't actually belong to your present moment. They belong to the past. And yet the past has a way of masquerading as the present, holding you hostage, chaining your heart, limiting your possibilities. In the wisdom of Zen, the past is compared to a shadow. No matter how far you walk, no matter how brightly the sun shines, the shadow always follows. But a shadow has no substance. It cannot harm you unless you keep turning to fight it. The question is, how long will you keep wrestling with what has already gone? This is why the idea of cleaning your past is so powerful. It is not about pretending that mistakes never happened or burying your pain under a smile. It is about facing what was, acknowledging it, and then gently washing it away like dust from a mirror, so that what remains is clarity, so that what remains is the real you. Master Shihengyi reminds us that no matter how holy or accomplished a person may seem, everyone has dark corners in their history. Nobody is exempt. The difference lies in whether you allow those corners to define you, or whether you learn to transform them into lessons. To clean your past is to claim authority over your own life. Imagine, just for a moment, standing on a wide open field. You look behind you and see a long trail of stones, each one representing a regret, a failure, a wound. You've been dragging them for years, tied to your ankles. But now you realize you can untie the rope. You don't have to keep pulling that weight. You can set it down. You can walk forward without it. The Buddha taught that life is suffering, but he also taught that suffering is not permanent. It arises, it fades, and most importantly, it can be transcended. Your past mistakes are part of that truth. They arose, they hurt, and they taught you. But they do not need to dictate the rest of your journey. As we step into this teaching, let us ask ourselves, what burdens are we still carrying? Which stories from yesterday are stealing the joy of today? And are we willing, truly willing, to let them go? Because the path of Zen, the path of clarity, does not begin with perfection. It begins with honesty. It begins with the courage to say, yes, I stumbled. Yes, I fell. But I am more than my failures. And I choose to walk forward, clean, light, and awake. So let us begin here, together, standing at the threshold of transformation, ready to put down the weight of the past, and ready to discover what it means to move forward with nothing holding us back. When we finally dare to look at the weight we've been carrying, another truth quietly rises to the surface. Much of that weight is not just about mistakes. It's about the roles we've forced ourselves to play. From the moment we are born, the world begins handing us scripts. Be a good son. Be a good daughter. Be successful. Be strong. Don't show weakness. Be perfect. We put on masks to please others and sometimes to protect ourselves. Over time, these masks harden into identities, and those identities become prisons. Think of it this way. You step onto a stage and at first it feels like play. You perform a role, student, professional, partner, parent. But years go by and you forget that it was ever a performance. You start believing the mask is your face. And then one day you wake up feeling suffocated because deep inside you know that the role you've been keeping up no longer fits. Master Shihengyi puts it simply. The roles we maintain, the personas we cling to, eventually become unbearable. Why? Because they limit us. They shrink us into something smaller than who we really are. And here lies the struggle. We spend so much energy keeping up appearances, proving to others that we are capable, lovable, worthy, that we lose touch with the quiet, authentic self inside. The self that doesn't need approval, the self that simply is. In Zen, this is called the illusion of self. The Buddha taught that the idea of a fixed identity, this rigid I am this, I am not that, is a root of suffering. Because when life changes, as it always does, the mask begins to crack. And instead of embracing the change, we panic, desperately patching up the role, afraid of what will be revealed when it finally falls away. But ask yourself, how many times have you felt this pressure? Maybe you've worked in a job that gave you security but stole your joy. Maybe you've kept up a smile for your family while quietly breaking inside. Maybe you've chased achievements, not because they mattered to you, but because they made you look successful in the eyes of others. We wear these roles until they crush us, until we look in the mirror and realize we no longer recognize the person staring back. The Zen path offers another way, to see the roles, to acknowledge them, but not to be defined by them. Like an actor who knows that once the play ends, the costume can be set aside, we too can step off the stage of false identity. We can return to our essence, the part of us that was whole before the world handed us masks. Here's the paradox. Letting go of roles is not about losing who you are. It's about rediscovering the self that was never lost. The self that is larger than any mask, freer than any label, and lighter than any identity you've been forced to carry. Imagine shedding a role the way a tree sheds old leaves. The tree does not mourn the leaves it no longer needs. It trusts the cycle of renewal. In the same way, when you release a role that no longer serves you, you don't become less, you make space to grow into more. So the question is not whether you play roles. Everyone does. The question is, do you know when it's time to put one down? Do you know how to step out of the costume and breathe as your true self? If we are to clean our past, we must also clean these identities that no longer belong. Only then can we move freely, lighter, truer, and closer to our essence. Once we begin to see the masks and roles we've been carrying, the next step isn't to throw them away in haste. No. The beginning of true transformation is far gentler, yet far more difficult. It begins with observation. Self-observation is not about judging yourself, not about labeling every thought as good or bad, success or failure. It is about watching, silently, patiently, with the eyes of a witness. Think of it as holding up a mirror, not to criticize, but to see. For most of us, our lives are filled with endless doing. We rush from one task to another, from one responsibility to the next. Rarely do we pause and ask, why am I doing this? Is it truly me, or is it just a role I've been playing? In Zen practice, the very act of watching the mind, like watching clouds pass across the sky, creates distance between you and the storm. You begin to notice the patterns that have ruled you for years. The anger that rises in traffic, the anxiety that appears before a meeting, the sadness that returns in the quiet hours of the night. At first, this can be uncomfortable. When you observe yourself deeply, you see truths that are hard to face. You see how often you are driven by fear, how often you act out of habit rather than choice. You see the weight of the past pressing on your present. But this is the beginning of cleansing, because you cannot clean what you refuse to see. Imagine a room filled with dust. If the windows are closed and the curtains drawn, the dust remains invisible, even though you breathe it in every day. But when you open the curtains, when the sunlight pours in, suddenly the dust becomes clear. You may not like seeing it, but now you know where to sweep. This is what self-observation does. It brings light to the hidden corners of your being, and slowly, gently, you begin to sweep. Buddhism calls this mindfulness. The practice of being fully present, fully aware, not lost in the regrets of yesterday or the fears of tomorrow. When you eat, you notice the taste. When you walk, you feel the ground beneath your feet. When you breathe, you actually feel the breath entering and leaving your body. Through such simple awareness, you start to reconnect with your essence. You realize how much of your suffering comes not from reality itself, but from the stories your mind weaves about reality. The past clings because you replay it. The future terrifies because you project it. But in this moment, this breath, there is only clarity. I remember a story about a Zen master who was asked, "Master, what is enlightenment?" He replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." The student was puzzled. Surely it must be more than that, but the master smiled, because to truly eat when eating, to truly sleep when sleeping without being dragged away by the chatter of the mind, that is self-observation leading to freedom. So here is the invitation: pause, watch. Before you react, observe. Before you judge yourself, observe. Before you cling to the past or escape into the future, observe. Like a river that clears once the mud settles, your mind too begins to find its own clarity when you stop stirring it with constant noise. Cleaning begins here, not with effortful struggle, not with dramatic change, but with the quiet courage to face yourself. To look honestly at your life, your choices, your emotions, and to see without running away. Because once you see, you cannot unsee. And once you see clearly, the path to cleansing unfolds by itself. When you begin to observe the mind, you realize something profound. The mind is restless, always moving, like a monkey jumping from branch to branch. But there is an anchor available to every one of us, always present, always accessible: the body. Your body is not just a shell carrying you from one place to another. It is the first temple, the most intimate companion, and the truest messenger you will ever have. It whispers to you constantly, though most of the time you are too busy or too distracted to listen. Think about it. How often do you ignore the signals your body gives? The tightness in your shoulders when stress builds, the shallow breathing when anxiety takes over, the heaviness in your stomach when regret lingers. The body speaks with honesty. It does not lie. And when we ignore it, we lose our connection to the present moment. Master Shi Heng once said, "A healthy body carries the possibility for a healthy mind." This is why awareness must start here, with the body. Before chasing enlightenment in lofty thoughts, ground yourself in the rhythm of breath, in the sensation of movement, in the stillness of sitting. Breathing in, you feel the breath enter. Breathing out, you feel it leave. It sounds simple, even too simple, but try it, really try it, and you will notice something. Your wandering mind begins to settle. Your attention begins to return. The body and mind, once strangers, begin to harmonize again. Let me share a story. There was once a monk who spent years trying to meditate, but every time he sat down, his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. He went to his teacher in frustration. The teacher smiled and handed him a broom. "Sweep the floor," he said. The monk swept. "Now walk slowly around the courtyard." The teacher continued. The monk walked. Day after day, he was told to sweep, to walk, to breathe, to feel each step. At first, he thought it was pointless, but then he began to notice something. His breath was calmer, his steps lighter, his mind less noisy. In simply reconnecting with his body, he had built the foundation he was missing. Enlightenment was not hiding in faraway scriptures. It was grounded in his own body, in his own breath, in the simplicity of presence. This is the lesson. If you want clarity, start here. Do not underestimate the power of small practices. Stretching in the morning, standing with awareness, walking without rushing, eating with full attention. They are not trivial. They are training the bridge between body and mind. Modern science now echoes what ancient wisdom has taught for centuries. Breathwork reduces stress, mindful movement improves focus, and listening to the body strengthens resilience. What Buddhists discovered through centuries of practice, neuroscience now confirms. Body awareness is not optional. It is essential. So if the past feels heavy, if your mind feels cluttered, return to your body. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel the rise and fall of your breath. Let your awareness sink into the rhythm of your own existence, because clarity is not something you find outside. It begins in the quiet intimacy of your body, in the trust you rebuild with yourself. When body and mind move together, when you are no longer a hollow shell, you begin to feel whole again. And from that wholeness, the journey forward becomes clear. When the body becomes your anchor, a new doorway opens: the breath. The breath is not just oxygen filling your lungs. It is life itself, the rhythm of existence, the most intimate bridge between your body and your mind. Notice how every emotion you feel is tied to the breath. When you're anxious, the breath becomes shallow. When you're angry, it becomes sharp. When you're calm, it flows like a gentle stream. The breath reflects the state of your mind, and at the same time, it shapes it. That is the secret. Where the breath goes, the mind follows. Where the mind goes, energy flows. This is why in Zen and in martial arts, the first discipline is always to master the breath. Because if your breath is scattered, your life is scattered. But if your breath is calm and steady, your entire being finds balance. Imagine walking through a noisy city street. Cars honk, people rush, neon lights flash, all around you chaos. Yet if you take a single conscious breath, everything slows down. The noise remains, but inside there is quiet. That is the power of breath. It anchors you in the present moment no matter what storms are outside. Let me tell you a story. A student once asked his Zen master, "Master, how can I control my thoughts? They are wild and endless." The master replied, "You cannot control the wind, but you can control the sail." The student was confused. The master placed his hand on the student's chest and said, "Sail is here, your breath. Learn to breathe, and the winds of the mind will no longer carry you away." This is more than metaphor. Ancient teachings and modern science both agree. The breath regulates the nervous system. It calms the heart, clears the mind, and brings energy back into flow. Breath is not passive. It is a tool, a compass, a key to unlock harmony. Think of the last time you felt truly alive, not just existing, but alive. Chances are your breath was engaged. Perhaps it was during exercise, or laughing deeply, or standing in awe before nature. Your breath was full, your mind was present, and energy moved freely through you. That is harmony. But here's the danger. Most people forget to breathe. Not literally, of course. We all breathe to survive, but few breathe to live. We rush through days holding our breath in stress, choking the flow of life without even noticing. We exist like hollow shells. Our bodies here, but our minds somewhere else. To break this cycle, begin small. Take moments to pause and breathe fully. Inhale with awareness, exhale with release. Place your attention on the breath and watch how your energy follows. It is impossible to breathe deeply and remain tense at the same time. It is impossible to breathe consciously and stay lost in the past or the future. Breath brings you home. And when body, mind, and breath unite, energy awakens. This energy is not mystical. It is vitality, strength, resilience. It is the force that allows you to walk through difficulties without being broken, to remain centered while the world pulls at you from every direction. Harmony is not about escaping life's storms. It is about standing in the middle of them and breathing, fully alive, fully present. So remember this. Your breath is your anchor, your bridge, your sail. And with each conscious breath, you step closer to the freedom you have always been seeking. The breath draws us back into the present, but here lies the true challenge, staying there. For the mind has a habit, a stubborn habit. It loves to escape. It runs backward into the past, clinging to memories, regrets, and guilt. Or it rushes forward into the future, chasing desires, fears, and endless what-ifs. And what happens when the mind keeps running? You become a prisoner of illusions. Think of this, the past no longer exists. It is gone, a shadow, a memory stored in your mind. And the future, no matter how vivid your imagination, does not exist yet. It is only a projection, yet we spend most of our lives lost in these realms that are not real. Meanwhile, the only thing that truly exists, the present moment, slips through our fingers unnoticed. A Zen saying captures it well. When walking, walk. When eating, eat. It sounds simple, even obvious, but observe yourself. How often do you walk while thinking of something else? How often do you eat while your mind is far away? This is how illusions steal your life, moment by moment. Let me share a story. A young man once visited a monk saying, "Master, I cannot sleep. My mind is always restless. At night I think about the mistakes I made years ago. During the day I worry about what might happen tomorrow." The monk handed him a cup of tea and said, "Drink this." The young man drank, but his thoughts were still restless. The monk then poured more tea until it spilled over the cup. Startled, the young man exclaimed, "Master, the cup is already full." The monk smiled. "So is your mind, too full of yesterday and tomorrow. Empty it and you will taste the tea of today." That is the essence. The present moment is the only place where life happens. The past is a teacher, but it should not be a prison. The future is a direction, but it should not be a chain. The present moment is where transformation is possible, where peace is found, where joy can be experienced. And here is the paradox. We think that dwelling on the past will somehow change it, but it never does. We think worrying about the future will somehow prepare us, but it only drains our energy. Illusions promise security, but they deliver suffering. Living in the present is not an escape from responsibility. It does not mean forgetting what has happened or ignoring what may come. It means engaging fully with what is right here, right now. If you are working, work. If you are resting, rest. If you are with a loved one, be truly with them. Because when your mind and your body are in two different places, your life is divided. But when they meet in the same moment, life becomes whole again. And in that wholeness, stress dissolves, clarity arises, and even the smallest act, like sipping tea, feeling the sun on your skin, or hearing the sound of your own breath, becomes sacred. The illusions will always try to pull you away. But with awareness, you can smile at them, acknowledge them, and gently return home to the present. Here and only here is where freedom lives. Life will test you. That is not a possibility, it is a certainty. No matter how kind you are, no matter how disciplined or spiritual you may become, there will be moments when the world feels unfair, when circumstances press down on you, when people criticize you unjustly, and when your strength seems too small for the weight you are asked to carry. And here is the truth. Resilience is not about avoiding pressure. It is about learning how to stand beneath it without breaking. Think of bamboo. In a storm, it bends with the wind. It does not resist rigidly like a stone wall, for walls crack and collapse. Bamboo bows, sways, and sometimes touches the ground, but when the storm passes, it rises again. That is resilience, flexibility without losing strength, endurance without losing essence. Many people believe resilience means never feeling pain or never showing weakness. But that is not true. To endure pressure is not to deny your struggles. It is to face them without letting them destroy your core. You may bend, but you do not break. You may stumble, but you rise again. There are two kinds of people I've often observed. The first type crumbles at the slightest difficulty. A harsh word, a minor failure, and they collapse into despair. The second type can withstand enormous burdens, work stress, family challenges, criticism from the world, yet they remain steady, like a mountain standing through the seasons. What makes the difference? It is not luck, nor is it privilege. It is training of the mind. Just as the body grows stronger through exercise, the spirit grows stronger through trials. Each obstacle is not meant to crush you, but to carve you into something greater. Let me share a story. A potter once molded clay into a jar. The apprentice asked, "Why do you place it into the fire?" The potter replied, "Because without fire, it will remain soft, fragile, and useless. Only the fire gives it strength." In the same way, life's pressures are the fire that makes us unbreakable. But here lies the warning. There is a thin line between resilience and suppression. Many people endure silently but never release, never heal. They build walls so high that eventually the pressure explodes from within. Resilience is not about ignoring your pain, it is about transforming it. Like bamboo, you bend when needed, but always return to balance. So how do we cultivate this kind of resilience? We begin by accepting that life is not meant to bow to us. The world will not rearrange itself to make our path smooth. Instead, we learn to regulate ourselves, to find calm in chaos, clarity in conflict, and strength in setbacks. It begins with awareness, noticing your reaction when pressure comes. Do you tense, fight, or collapse? Or do you breathe, observe, and adjust? That pause, that single breath, can mean the difference between breaking under pressure and standing tall within it. And most importantly, resilience is not for you alone. Every hardship you endure with wisdom becomes a gift for those who come after you. The struggles your parents could not overcome became yours to face. And the struggles you master today will no longer burden the next generation. In this way, resilience is not just survival, it is legacy. So when the weight of life presses on you, remember this. You are not meant to be unshaken. You are meant to bend, to adapt, to rise again and again, each time stronger, wiser, and more unbreakable than before. That is the art of resilience, to endure pressure without losing your spirit. Every human being longs for something: peace, success, love, or freedom. But the uncomfortable truth is this: wanting is easy, but being willing to pay the price is where most people stop. Growth demands sacrifice, and without it, desire remains only a dream. Think about it. You cannot step into a larger life while still clinging to the comforts of the smaller one. To climb a mountain, you must leave the valley. To light a fire, you must surrender the wood. And to become the person you are meant to be, you must let go of parts of who you were. Sacrifice is not punishment, it is transformation. Yet in modern times, people often resist it. We are told we can have everything: success without effort, wisdom without discipline, fulfillment without struggle. But life does not work this way. Even the Buddha himself left his palace, his comforts, his family's expectations. He sacrificed everything familiar to discover the truth of suffering and liberation. Without that sacrifice, there would be no Dharma. Ask yourself, what are you willing to give up for your growth? Are you willing to sacrifice laziness for discipline, comfort for courage, the temporary pleasure of old habits for the lasting joy of inner freedom? There's a story of a farmer whose land was overrun by weeds. Each year, he complained that the crops would not grow. A wise neighbor asked, "Why don't you clear the weeds?" The farmer sighed, but that would take too much work. And so he continued to harvest nothing. His unwillingness to sacrifice his ease cost him the very harvest he desired. In the same way, if we refuse to release what weighs us down, we cannot receive what life longs to give us. The path of growth always asks for an offering. Sometimes it is your time, sometimes your comfort, sometimes even your pride. But notice this: the things we sacrifice are never truly lost, they are exchanged. You give up distraction and you gain clarity. You give up fear and you gain freedom. You give up attachment and you gain peace. In the end, the trade is always in your favor. Yet this requires willingness. And willingness is a kind of courage. It is looking at the unknown and saying, "I am afraid, but I will step forward anyway." It is choosing growth over comfort, long-term wisdom over short-term ease. In every generation, people face this same choice. Our parents carried struggles they could not overcome, and those burdens became ours. If we choose to sacrifice, to break harmful cycles, to release destructive patterns, then the next generation is freed. This is how humanity evolves, one act of willingness at a time. Remember, nothing in life comes without a cost. The question is not whether you will sacrifice, but what you will sacrifice. Will you give up your growth for the sake of comfort, or give up your comfort for the sake of growth? True mastery lies in choosing the second, for only when you surrender what no longer serves you can you step into the life that has been waiting for you all along. When we talk about cleaning the past, it's easy to think only of ourselves, our regrets, our mistakes, our memories that still sting. But the truth is, the past is never just personal. It runs like a river through generations. What your parents could not resolve becomes your struggle, and what you refuse to heal today will become the burden of your children tomorrow. Life is like a great tapestry, woven thread by thread across time. Each of us inherits threads from those before us, some bright and strong, others frayed and tangled. We cannot choose what we are given, but we can choose what we pass on. This is why cleaning the past is not just self-care. It is an act of love for those who come after us. Think about the silent struggles your parents carried. Maybe they endured poverty, and you still feel their fear of not having enough. Maybe they were trapped in anger, and you notice the same fire in yourself. Maybe they were wounded in love, and that same wound echoes in your relationships. These are not accidents, they are patterns passed down like invisible heirlooms. But here is the hope: the cycle can be broken. When you face your past and begin to clean it, you are not just liberating yourself. You are cutting chains that have bound your family for generations. There is a Zen parable about a monk who carried a heavy sack of stones everywhere he went. His teacher asked him, "Why do you carry such a burden?" The monk replied, "These stones were given to me by my father, and he received them from his father. I cannot throw them away. It would be dishonoring them." The teacher smiled gently and said, "To honor your ancestors is not to carry their stones. It is to free yourself from the weight they could not lay down." Every act of healing you undertake is a gift to the future. When you forgive someone who hurt you, your children inherit a lighter heart. When you confront your fears, your grandchildren are born into more courage. When you end the cycle of resentment, you plant seeds of peace in soil that once carried anger. Cleaning the past is not easy. It demands honesty, patience, and courage. It asks you to face wounds that are not even yours alone. But imagine the power of knowing that because of your willingness to heal, your family tree will grow stronger, straighter, freer. You are not only living for yourself, you are a bridge between those who came before and those who will come after. Your choices ripple across time. And so when you clean your past, you are doing more than moving forward for your own sake. You are offering the next generation a priceless inheritance, the chance to live without carrying the debris of yesterday. This is the true meaning of legacy. Not money, not property, not titles, but the invisible strength of a clean heart, a clear mind, and a soul free of old burdens. Because what you choose to heal today is what your children will no longer have to suffer tomorrow. Life is heavy when we carry too much of yesterday. Regret, anger, guilt, unhealed wounds, these are like stones we hide in our pockets. At first they seem small, but over time the weight grows unbearable. To clean the past is to finally empty those pockets, to set down what no longer belongs to you, to forgive yourself for mistakes that were part of being human, to release others from the prisons you've kept them in, inside your mind, and to accept that the past is a place of lessons, not a place to live. When you clean your past, something beautiful happens. Your steps become lighter, your heart beats with more ease, your mind begins to see clearly, and in that lightness you discover freedom, the kind of freedom no one can take from you. Zen has always taught that liberation is not found in adding more, but in letting go. Just as the lotus rises from the mud unstained, you too can rise from your past unburdened. Remember, the past shaped you, but it does not define you. The future awaits you, but it is not yet written. What matters most is how you choose to walk in this present moment, with clarity, with compassion, with peace. So as you move forward, let your past be a teacher, not a jailer. Let it guide you, not chain you. And with each step, walk lighter, freer, more alive. Because when you clean your past, you don't just move forward, you soar. If this teaching has touched your heart, take a deep breath and hold this wisdom close. And if you'd like to continue this journey of clarity, peace, and Zen wisdom with us, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here we walk together, learning, letting go, and living fully. May you find lightness in every step, and may your path be guided by wisdom and compassion. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. Until next time, breathe deeply, live gently, and stay awake to the beauty of your life.